briefly define the halachic process. What is the halachic process in 3 words? Probably the 3 words I would choose is ledamois, milsa, ulamilsa. Loosely translated, comparing one thing to another. If we have 4 words instead of 3, it would be lahavin davar, mitoich davar. So our code of law was formulated 2,000 years ago, codified and redefined 900 years ago, further developed 500 years ago, and I'm referring to Chasimas Talmud, the days of the Mishnah, the Gemara, stage number 2, the Rambam, stage number 3, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Mappa, and the Ramah. And in every field of halacha, the challenge of poskim is ledamis milsa. So first of all, you need a huge amount of bekiyas to be familiar with the sources. And then you need svara yeshora to know ledamis milsa, similar or different. So the 2 fundamental tools of Gedolei Torah, Shebekol Doyer V'Doyer, and especially Poskei Halacha Shebekol Doyer V'Doyer, are Yediyas HaTorah, being familiar with the sources, and Yosher HaSavora, to know what is comparable, what could we derive and learn from our ancient sources. And when using 2 magical words, yesh lechalek, ein lechalek, yesh ledamois, or yesh lechalek. And I think today's shiur is really a classical study of this nature. So going all the way back to the Mishnah, Oser leishois, shemeyachate bigecholim. Reb Shlomo, are you with me? Because I don't see you. My dear friends, are you with me? Do you hear me? Do you see me?
We see the Rav, we hear the Rav, here I am. I turn off my box when the Rav speaks to have it full screen of the Rav.
So there's a fire, and the fire is fed by coal or charcoal. And he will stoke the fire. And then there's a fundamental machlokes, which is reflected in Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph. Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph is one of the lengthy and complicated sifim in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. Machlokes Chananya and Chachamim. By which Mecholam Chazal were choishes Shema Yover Lachatas L'Yecholam. According to Chananya, only Loines Bashal Kamachal Ben Drisoi, Shlish B'Shiloi, a third, 33% of Bishul, 50% of Bishul, Machlokes Rishonim, Chachamim say, Mitztamik B'Yofalim. Even though it's totally fitting for consumption, but if it still is improving and the taste is enhanced, it's getting better, also Rishois. And this is a Machlokes Shulchan Aruch HaRamah. Shulchan Aruch is Machmir, the Mechaber, Stamik V'Yofaroi, the Ramah is Mekel, there is no Isser, if it is already Kemachal Ben Dusai. And then the Machlokes Bir Halacha and Chazon Ish, based on the ruling of the Ramah, that is Mekel, Keshittas Chananya. Bir Halacha writes, after all, it's a Machlokes Mechaber and Ramah, V'yesh Lahachnia. If it's not a Shas Chak, Chazon Ish, Lamed Zayin, Ois Gimel, Ois Vav, B'nei Ashkenaz, that I know you come in a Ramah, Ein Tzorach Lahachnia. Under what circumstances is it mutar lishois tanor, grifa uketuma? And then there's the machlokes and a shaylim. What is gerufa and what is ketuma? So fundamentally, gerufa is if you remove the gecholim, you remove the coal. If you remove the coal, there no longer is a chashash miyavalachatis because there is no fire ba'ain. Ein ma lachatos. That is the interpretation of Rambam and Ramban and many Rishonim. Gerufa means you took all the coal out of the Tano. However, the Ran and the Balamora says Gerufa is like a matzah oven. Did you ever look into a matzah oven? Probably you did. So the wood that's burning, or in the modern matzah oven, which I don't really like, it's gas that's burning, is on the sides. So according to some Rishonim, Gerufa doesn't mean that you removed all the coal, but rather you shoved it aside. And the reason we are matir is heker ba'alma. So if the person will feel there's not enough heat, he wants his food to be cooked faster and better, there's not a chashash miyavalachatis because there's a heker. There's a reminder. It's like a red light flashing in his face. The Rambam, Hilchos Shabbos Perek Gimel Halacha Daled writes, Gorov v'kotum is psychology. Is siach datoi min hatavshin. So if the person did any ma'isa which causes the food not to be cooked fast, but rather slow, that is sufficient. So one approach is Grifa Vektumer prevents the possibility of Shemiyo Barachatois. The other approach is there is a heker, so it is not likely Shiyo Barachatois. And what we see from the Rambam is it's more about the psychology. If he did any act which cools off the Tana, instead of making it hotter, he made it cooler, then there is no longer a chashash shema yavoi lechatos. So these are the fundamental ideas. Kotum means putting a layer of ash on top of the coal. It doesn't extinguish the flame, the fire, but it definitely makes it smaller. It diminishes the heat. Rashi writes, Ketumo is mema'et chaymoi. The Ran once again writes, it is all about heker. So if the person will want to stoke the fire, his food should be cooked faster, he will realize, he will see, he will notice, but he spread ashes over the fire, and that heker will be a reminder. I apologize, I'm just standing up one moment. I want to take my phones out of the room. They shouldn't bother us. I have some old phones I never use anyway, and I don't know how to silence them, so I just need to take them out of the room. Okay. Ad kan, whatever I said is just the fundamentals of the sugya. So the modern kitchen has evolved and changed, just like any other aspect of our lives. I don't recall when it was, but I think one of the shulim I gave to our wonderful Yarchikal in the past more than 2 years, I said a shir about the concept of Dumya de Mishkan. Hilchos Shabbos Ein chayovim aleim only v'dumya the Mishkan. They need to resemble the malachas that were done in the Mishkan. And I thought I brought about 10 or 12 sources from the days of the Rishonim till the days of the Achronim. And we try to develop a gedoras and a discussion to what extent, to what degree, in what way does the malacha need to be dumya the Mishkan. It should be defined and considered the malacha d'oraisa. And I made a comment. Nothing we do today is dumya the Mishkan. Nothing we do today is done in the same form, in the same methodology, in the same way as we did the malacha 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. Nothing is the way it was. And therefore, my opinion was the Mishkan is just the fundamentals of the malacha, the essence of the malacha, and not the derech hasiyas of malacha. But that's a different discussion. What I want right now is, so the kitchen has evolved. In our modern kitchen, is there a chashash shemayover lachatois? We no longer have coal in our ovens. So is the Isser of Shia v'Hatamona still relevant? Or would we say, Ein lecho elo masha asru chachamim? This discussion starts 300 years ago. Because when we talk about technology, what comes to our mind is the internet and global positioning systems, which is abbreviated GPS and high-tech and robotics and bionics and amazing new technologies. But technology is as old as we are. The wheel was a breakthrough in technology. Shari Tshuva, Reish Nun Dalet Sif Cotton Base calls the Ponameiris. The Ponameiris is Ramea Eisenstadt. Was the greatest poisek 300 years ago. Charles Tshuva's Ponameiris, Chelekalav Semen Pei Dalet. He speaks about a primus. Okay, here we are with the Shari Tshuva.
It's the last piece in Reish Nun Daled, end of Reish Nun Daled. Be there in a second.
Here we are.
One more. I'll tell you when to stop. Here we go.
Here we are. Kosev bepunem meirois. Sheyesh noyagim shenoisnem hasir shel tei. Samach lechasheicha Friday afternoon al klei barzel. Benoisnem tacht of maske chalef shekoiden spiritus. You know what spiritus is? The old Polish Yidden could tell you what is spiritus. It's alcohol, spirits. And it's interesting, the way the Purim Edis describes this, it's maske chalef. Well, in Poland, they drank 16 ago. Are you familiar with what is 16 ago? Well, 96% alcohol. Just one moment.
We're familiar with the concept. The Rav is coming off a little bit not clear audio-wise. Okay, let's try it.
Is it better now?
Okay.
Is it better?
Yes, the Rav had moved away from the mic, but now it's better.
Okay, yeah, I just need to adjust the screen. You know, if you would see how my screen stands, it's also a technological marvel. I put some sforim here and there. So anyway, so noisnem maske charef shekodesh spiritus v'noisnem psile v'doile kol halaylo ad lemacharosoi v'yom Shabbos. Lokchem al yedei eine Yehudi akadera ma'al weish v'zeh iser gomor kekire v'kupach she'enoi goro v'kotu. And it is the same Isser, but ein loimar de loisha yechitu she'ein kan gecholem ela mashka hadoilet du chazinan כשממרסן בתוך המשקה הלאו אוי ליוסו, ויש לוחש לחיטוי, ולכן חיוב המכך מידו למחויס ביודו. What we learned from this Purim Eiros, it was a common minhag. And he is demanding from the Chachmei Ador, come out against this minhag. So, it's a primus. What is a primus? Well, okay, Anshe Yerushalayim used primusim till 50 years ago. Well, it's a kli bazel, and there's a flame. And what feeds the flame, the fuel, is alcohol. So there is no gecholim, you can't stoke a fire. So this is very strange, because what I understand from physics or whatever it is, so the Paramiya says, if you mix the alcohol, then you're making the flame bigger, which is strange to me. I don't know why the flame would be bigger if you mix the alcohol. But anyway, what the Pona Me'iris argues is the Gezerah is the same Gezerah, whether it's coal or alcohol, whether it's solid or it's liquid. As long as there is a chashash, the person will want more heat, and he has the ability to get more heat and to stoke the fire and make the flame bigger. It is b'chlal the gezerah of shebiyachata b'gecholim. And we don't say, no. Rather we say, zil bosar taima. What is the reasoning? Same reasoning. The person has foodstuff on a fire. Theoretically, it might be too cold for his taste. He will want a hotter tea. So, and he has the ability to get a hotter tea because he could mix the alcohol or whatever type of fuel he is using and get the fire bigger and warm up his tea. It's b'chlal di gezerah. 150 years later, Shuvas Maharshag, the Mashag was of Shimon Greenfeld, one of the greatest Gedolim in Hungary, a very original posek. And a chelik beis of his Shuvas, as I quoted, he says, Ein ledamois milsa la milsa, ve'ein lecha elo ma she'aslo chachomim. And Chachomim only dealt with shebiyachata b'gecholim, and we have no authority to make new gezeres. Do we have the Mashag on our screen or not? It would be interesting to check if we do, but it's not essential, doesn't need to be. So this is a machloikis, which we find similar discussions in many sources in the Poskim, and the Mashag says, well, yes, using this primitive type of primus, theoretically there's a possibility to enhance the fire, but it's not what Chazal were geyser. So this is the very first discussion. Do we broaden the scope of shebiyachata, or we say, Ein lecha elo ma shetok lechachamim ve'ein lahoisef aleihem. Another 50 years transpired, so we no longer heat tea on a primus, and we no longer use vodka or Zexenanziger to keep our tea warm. So today we use either gas or electricity. So how do we deal with a fire which is fed by gas or with a Shabbos platter? And this discussion goes back 70, 80 years. Very first Chelik in Igris Moshe, Chelik Aleph Siman Tzadik Gimel. The Moshe deals with a stove top which is fire fed by gas. No longer alcohol, no longer liquid, but rather by gas. So one could argue liquid is fuel that you see with your eyes. So it's not so far-fetched to say, what's the difference between solid and liquid? It's the same. Maybe gas is different. Gas is something you don't see. But Reb Moshe's argument is a different argument. And Reb Moshe says, you're not going to feed new fuel to the fire. Chazal were never choishes you're going to feed new fuel into the fire. If Chazal would be choishes, then Grufa V'Tuma wouldn't work. Kash V'Gabava wouldn't be a reasonable kula, because he could always put more kash and more gabava into the fire. So it's obvious, Chazal aren't choishes she's going to feed the fire with additional fuel. Chazal are only choishes she's going to stoke the coal, the wood that's already in the oven. And that same argument goes to the Poramidus and the Marshag. The Poramidus is not choishes she's going to add more fuel, more schnapps. One of the Poramidus says, if you mix it, you're enhancing the flame. Argues that Moshe, the only way to make the fire bigger is by turning up the gas, which means adding more fuel. Chazal whenever choishes, you're going to add more fuel. So maybe you don't need a blech, according to Reb Moshe. Reb Moshe also says, maybe it's only Shemiyachat B'Gecholim. There are no Gecholim in our modern stovetops. V'yafal piken, Reb Moshe is Machmir, and he is not Mekel Lahalocha. And why is that? I think it's right. Sometimes Gezeras are based on the practicalities and not necessarily on the essence of things. Yes, it's true. When your fire is fed by gas, you can't stoke the gas, you can't mix the gas. Gas is a gas. The only way to make the fire bigger is by feeding more gas into the fire. So on one hand, that would be similar to adding wood into the oven. But on the other hand, no. Adding wood is a terche. Adding wood would mean that he has to go to somewhere, bring wood, put it into the oven. But the way to add gas is thus to turn a knob. Turning a knob would be no different than chitui b'gecholim. Turning a knob would be no different than memares b'mashke. So on one hand, we could argue it's adding fuel. Chazal weren't choshesh that is going to add fuel. But on the other hand, in practicality, it's not a tercha. It's not going out of your house and schlepping some buckets of coal or pieces of firewood. Just turning on the knob. It's easier than chitui b'gecholim. It's easier than memares b'mashka. And therefore, minig oilam, we use the blech. And the Shabbos blech goes all the way back 150 years. Shuvas Maharam Shik Orachaim Simen Kuf Yud Zayin. 150 years we find the blech, the cover of fire. And the Maharam Shik and all the Gedolim of later generations, including Reb Moshe, say, a blech is sufficient. All the Gedolim besides the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish Orach Chaim Lamed Zayin, Ostes, I don't know whether we can have it on our screen or not. Chazon Ish is machmir. He doesn't like the blech. And he says the blech would not be considered Gorov V'Kotu. Why not? So the Chazon Ish quotes Rashi. Gorov V'Kotu is memayet esacham. It diminishes the heat. Okay, so let's see where it is. Did you have it highlighted or not?
We'll get it highlighted in a second. We have to get the right paragraph. I'm going to give the site here. The site is Weiss Test, page 105. Weiss Test, Mishabura, Safe Cotton Perial. So the Chazon Ish discusses the tour starting on line 4. And he says the tour al Gaba, Blech al Gaba.
If you won't mind, I'm just standing up to get the Chazon Ish out because in my Chazon Ish I'll find it in a second. Okay, the discussion starts in Weiss Test, but what we need is Weiss Yud Aleph. This is a lengthy discussion. At the here it is, at the beginning of Yud Aleph. Shia de Noheg ba'artzenu ha'kedosha. Shepsiles hu eish lamato tachas ha'pitput. The pitput is, you know, that iron piece which you put the pots on. ושויפסן הגדרו למעלה על הפתפות, והוא איש תחס שולי הגדרו, דינוי כקיר שאינו גרופה, ואף אם מעמידן פח של מתכת, ומשימן הגדרה בתוך הפח, מכל מקום, לא חשוב כדין נוסן גדרה ריקונס על הקיר אלא הפסק. תוכה לא יעברה ככיסו אס הקירו. בכיסוי והמד הגדרה על הכיסוי, וזה חושב על גבו, כמו שכוספתי לאל Weiss Test. And therefore there's an issur of Shia and Hatamona. And in the continuation of this very same paragraph, he argues that it doesn't cool off the fire, the heat gets through, and it's also derech bishul. Let's go over to the next paragraph. Min ha'omur nilmad. Kefi sheragilen lahamed tafshel torch hapach lemata va'olav kumkum shel chamin. Es hachamin noit lo machzir kol zman shagdere v'torch hapach lo kach hagdere min hapach I efsher oil lachzir hachamin. And that is because it is not lishoy shori kol shenes basel kamachal ben drisoy kodem shekidesh hayom afel belo yefsek pach shor because aloche kechananya the Ramo also lachas asagdera. So anyway, the Chazon Ish argues the pach is not sufficient, but the Chazon Ish is a das yochid, and all the other poskim say it's about hekel. Ve'ein lecho heker godel meseh. Now, you must realize in this entire discussion, the Chazon Ish speaks about lahamed atav shel toich hapach, the blech as we know it, and probably very few people remember the blech. I do. But nobody uses a blech any longer because nobody uses Shabbos as stoved up with fire. Everybody today uses ceramics, electricity, or a Shabbos plata. But I remember the blech growing up. You know, I'm the old man in this room. So the Chazon Ish says the blech is sufficient, but the Chazon Ish speaks about a tafshel itut toichapach. The blech, as we know it, was flat. Didn't have a base kibul. So I asked, people that are a generation or two older than me, and they told me Yerushalayim, the blech was like a pot. It had a base kibul, and maybe that is why the Chazon Ish says it's not a heker. I don't know. Fast forward, the next development was a Shabbos plata. Shuvos Yitzchok quotes Rav Elyashiv. Rav Elyashiv felt that a Shabbos plata is also, it's not Gora V'chotu, because it's like Eish Be'ein. Minhag Olam, Shabbos plata is not Eish Be'ein. The Eish is the heating element. The heating element is covered by aluminum or whatever other metal surface it is. Ve'ein lechu heker godol meseh. And then there's a different discussion. Do you need to cover the fire, or you need to cover the knobs which you use to make the fire bigger or smaller? That is new technology. And once again, do we say Ein lechu ela ma she'omru chachamim, or do we say zil basar tama? Use your mind, use your reasoning. So all these questions boil down to the fundamental issue. B'gzeres chachamim, do we say zil basar tama? Is the chashash reasonable? Or we say, this is not what Chachamim talked about. So the first change that we find in Poskim is the primus, Bonamiris Manshad. Second development, the blech, covering the fire. Number 3 is the Shabbos plata. There's no fire. It's just a gadget, a tool. There's a heating element. Is that fire? So the Chazon Ish didn't like the plata. Rav Elyashiv didn't like the Shabbos. The Chazon Ish didn't like the blech. Rav Elyashiv didn't like the plata. Hanach lebnei Yisrael, im lo neviim hem b'nei neviim hem. And because ein derech lebasho in the Shabbos plata, minhag olim, that's Gora V'chotu. So when you cover the oven, the stove top with the blech, do you need to cover the knobs or just the fire? In days of Chazal, Hainu Hach, the only way to enhance the fire is by stoking the fire. If you cover the coal, couldn't stoke the fire. But today, the fire is on top of the stove and the knobs are on the side of the stove. So which of the two must be covered? If we say we're choishish shemayovalakatos, then you need to cover the knobs. But if it's all about heker, you need to cover the fire. That was the tekon of Chazal. Gora V'chotum is in the fire. So these are interesting discussions. As technology developed and the way we cook and warm food changed, Poskim needed to adapt. And with every new technology, we find new discussions in halacha. Halacha l'maisa, in the tshuvas that I wrote, I say you need to cover the heating element, and you also need to cover the knobs. So when we're dealing with these various gadgets, there are two different principles. One is שהייה ולחטוס, the other is מחזק ומבשל. This brings us to the question of crackpots. So the Shabbos platter was developed solely, exclusively for Shomer Shabbos. And the entire idea of the Shabbos platter is to have the means to keep food warm without getting into Shabbos problems. The crackpot was not developed for Shomer Shabbos. It's a technology in which you want to keep food warm or cook in a very gradual and slow way. So, by a crackpot, there is no age be'aim, but in my opinion, you need to cover the knobs. You need to tape over the knobs of the crackpot. There should be a hecker. You shouldn't turn up the heat. But then we still have the problem of mechzek umevashel. I don't know what our plan is. Reb Shlomo told me the next 2 weeks we're going to have a fascinating discussion about the status of a fetus in halacha. But maybe at some stage we'll get back to hatmona, and then we will further discuss the questions regarding a crackpot. So at this stage,
Mir Hashem, yes, we haven't learned the Yesaitis of Atmana yet. We did Shia in the middle of Chazara, so
okay. So Bezat Hashem. So I'm putting the crackpot aside, and we will further discuss it at some later stage. Another halachic issue I dealt with, and I assume that you did touch this sugya, is kidra chayese. So the Gemara on Shabbos Yud Ches says that if it's raw food, then there is no chashash שהייה ולחטוס. Because if the food is raw, obviously, he has no intention of eating it tonight. It's going to take hours till it's going to be fitting for consumption. And therefore, you don't need grufa v'ktuma if you want to put a pot of raw meat on the stove or in the oven. So today, many people like to eat some chunt late Friday night after you finished your meal, and before you go to sleep, they like to eat some chunt. And today, in the modern kitchen, even raw meat you could cook relatively fast. So is there still a heter of kedera chayese in our day and age? And in this question, once again, I wrote a short brief tshuva about this. Goes back to the same fundamental dilemma that I shared before. What is the heter of kedera chayese? Most of the Shonim say it's not going to be fitting for consumption tonight anyway. Tomorrow you have ample time. Tomorrow is going to be fitting for consumption without upping the heat. And whatever you do, you're not going to eat it tonight anyway. So there is no chashash שהייה ולחטוס, but the world has changed. If we turn up the heat, even raw meat could be cooked relatively fast. In our modern ovens, do we say, Ein lecho elo ma sha'asu chacham? So the Rambam in Parasha Mishnah and Shabbos Yud Ches says, even if the meat is cooked, if you throw a raw vegetable into the pot, that is enough to be considered kedera chayese. Why? Heker. According to the Rambam, it's all about heker. Loi Asru Chachamim, raw food. According to the Rambam's interpretation, L'chayre kedei l'chayes would be a heter today as well. But the Mishnah Berurah says, Ein halacha k'divrei Rambam. The Torah and the Shulchan Aruch don't bring this halacha that a raw vegetable is also mutar. And the Mishnah Berurah says, Ein halacha. And therefore, we have no basis to prove that if the meat could be fully cooked tonight, there would be a heter of the Deirach Hayes. This might be a machlokes between the Bialocha and the Chazon Ish, Lamed Zayin, Chov Beis, and the Bialocha and Reish Nun Daled. If you go to the Chazon Ish, Ois Chov Beis, the beginning of Chov Beis, when he quotes Reish Nun Gimel Sif Aleph, Dove Shaloin is Mashal Klal, the Mishnah Berurah Sif Kot Yudal of Kosav Afila Ucham, Mutar, given the Etzem Abishu Loin is Mashal Klal.
Bottom of 110 to top of 111. On the screen, quite around.
Okay. So in the second paragraph, the Bir Halacha, Mashma, She'im Dater Lechol Belaylo Osu, ולפי זה כל דין כדי לחייס מכרע בסתומה. ולחוירה, כל נויסן גדרה יש בליבו ייחוד לאיזה סודה ומכינוי. So it depends what the person has in mind. If he wants it for tonight, it's also. Wants it for tomorrow, it's musa. V'hoyu nera, deloi gazru chachamim afilu dater la'ochloi b'laylo u'mitzapa olav, kiven da'al HaRav, einam Mashem Kidra Chayasa Eila Letzoirach Mochar. So the Chazon Ish learns from the Mishnah Berurah, it depends. It depends on the personal intention of the person putting that pot on the fire. And the Chazon Ish says no. So once again, Mishnah Berurah says, apply reasoning. Chazon Ish says, Ein lecho ela masher gazlu chachamim. So if you put the chunt on your platter, and b'knisas Shabbos, it's not cooked at all, according to the Chazon Ish, you could put it on the fire. You don't need a platter. It's a gedera chayisa. And even if your custom is to eat chunt late at night, Friday night, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Al pi Rav, Kedera Chayes is for tomorrow. Lo yosru chachamim. So in today's shiur, I didn't go into very relevant halacha l'maisa questions, but I think it was a fascinating study in the fundamental approach to halacha. To what degree do we apply reasoning? And to what degree do we say, Ein lecho ela ma she'asu chachamim? And just to hone in, I just briefly want to mention the first source I brought and the last source I brought. Source number one is the primus. It's not an oven with burning coal. Reb Shlomo, what's a primus in English? I have no idea.
A primus.
A primus is a primus. Okay. So the very first discussion was, we're dealing with liquid, we're dealing with alcohol, we're dealing with liquid fuel, not with coal. You can't stoke liquid. But the Pura Me'ira says, what does it make a difference, whether it's solid or liquid? Apply reasoning. You could mix the alcohol and enhance the fire. It's just like stoking coal and enhancing a fire. Shuvas Marshak says no. Chazal spoke about coal, they didn't speak about schnapps. Halachic upon me'iros. And that is why Rav Moshe says, even you're using gas is not coal. Gas, oh, okay, that's a primus. You see the bottom section? That's where the schnapps was. The top section, that's the pit put that we had in the Chazon Ish. And in the middle, that is where the fire burns, being fed by the fuel in the bottom section. That's a primus. Oh, this is technology, you see? We spoke about technology. This is technology. So, as we saw, the Purim Me'iris is right. And that is why the Moshe is machmir even by gas. Gas is less comparable to coal than liquid fuel is, but we're still chayshish. The very last machlokes I brought in today's year was the Mishnah Berurah and the Chazon Ish regarding raw food. Mishnah Berurah says, doesn't depend whether it's raw or cooked. It all depends. Does he intend to eat it tonight or tomorrow? And therefore, in the modern kitchen, when you could put a raw chont on the oven, on the fire, 5 minutes before the shkia, and you could turn up the fire, turn up the heat, and have it tonight. If he intends to eat it b'leil Shabbos, there is no heter of kedei l'chayisa. Chazon Ish says no. Ein lecho elo ma she'omru chachamim. And if Chazal said kedei l'chayisa is mutar, then it's mutar. And it does not depend on the intention of the individual. Does he want to eat that chum tonight or tomorrow? It depends on derech ha'olam, and especially derech ha'olam in the days of Chazal. So in the many discussions we had today, it's just an interesting study about the nature of halacha, of the halachic process. As I said, those three magical words, ledamois milson amilson, or the four words, lahavin davar, mitach davar. So in Sanhedrin Daf Chav Dalet, Reish Lakish says, did you see the mayor of the Beis HaMedrash? Oiker oroi oren v'toichnon zeh b'zeh. He uproots mountains and he's teichen. So to be a Gadol B'Yisrael and to be a Paisik, first of all, you need mountains. You need tilei tilim shel halachas. You need to be familiar with the sources. And then you need to be baki in maleches toichem. You need horei horim, tilei tilim, and then comes the process of toichnon zeh b'zeh, which is the process of halachic analysis and discussion, and yesh ledamois and yesh lechalet. Thank you, and we'll see each other at the Shia next Sunday. Be'ezras Hashem.